Henry Fonda was portrayed on screen as a kind of everyman in his early career, not quite a boy next door, but more of a friendly face you might run into on a hike through the woods. Later, he was often cast in fatherly roles, protectors, patriarchs, and even presidents on several occasions. His whole aura was wholesome and accessible, a hero anyone could admire. However, underneath, his life was being torn apart by madness, and he was seemingly haunted by death and division. Under the perfect surface, a darkness was lurking. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. You could argue that Henry Fonda was always destined to become a titan of Hollywood. He was brought into the world with a birth notice that had a certain dramatic flair in any case. The announcement read, "Dr. Roeder reports Unita biscuits for sale at any old price from salesman William Brace Fonda this morning." A bright baby boy having arrived at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fonda on West Division Street yesterday. That bright boy, born on May 16, 1905, was the first child of William and Herberta Fonda. The couple lived in a modest home in Grand Island, Nebraska, which a local banker had leased to them. A few months after Henry's arrival, the family moved to Omaha, where William had work as a printer. Hank, as his family affectionately called him, soon was joined by two little sisters, Harriet, who arrived in 1907, and Herberta Jane, who followed in 1909. As the years passed, the Fondas thrived. William purchased a spacious house in Dundee, an Omaha suburb, and later started his own printing business. This success meant that young Henry grew up on a street with the charming name of Happy Hollow Boulevard. It almost sounds like the start of a David Lynch movie, and like in a Lynch film, this seemingly perfect world would be brutally shattered by a lurking darkness later on. In the meantime, the print shop didn't just keep the family afloat, it also opened a window to a world of wonder for Henry. The shop sat opposite a Nickelodeon, where he spent countless Saturday afternoons entranced by the flickering images of William Hart and Charlie Chaplin. If a film felt too familiar, which meant he'd seen it 10 times already, he'd wander to the nearby Orpheum Theater, where he might catch Harry Houdini working his magical spells, or even a youthful Fred Astaire dancing alongside his sister Adele. William Fonda was unusual among fathers of his time. For a start, he was deeply engaged in his children's lives. When Henry was 4, William made him a kite. Later, he built his son an amateur radio set. As a child, Henry accepted this devotion as a given, but years later, as a grown man grappling with his own wayward kids, he realized how hard it must have been. He once said, "Only when I grew up and moved away did I realize exactly how much I loved him, how much he meant to me, and what an unusual man he was." That warm, steady upbringing gave Henry a childhood free of major upheavals. His father's family had practiced Christian Science for generations, and the Fonda children were raised in that tradition. Herberta, who was an Episcopalian, insisted that Henry be baptized at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Grand Island, and William was okay with that. The family's Christianity put a lot of importance on wholesome living, and was also skeptical about conventional medicine. So the Fondas diligently nurtured their physical and spiritual well-being. Nevertheless, Henry drifted from religion as an adult, eventually identifying as a religious agnostic. Henry, as a boy, kept to himself, especially when girls were around. He got along fine with his sisters, but whenever their friends came over, he'd slip away to avoid them. The outdoors suited him better. He loved the nearby lake, where he swam in the summer and skated when winter iced it over. Like many kids in his neighborhood, he joined the Boy Scouts of America, and he became an Eagle Scout in rank. When Henry reached the right age, his father, William, brought him into the family print shop. It was there, peering out from a window, that the teenager saw something that darkened his otherwise golden youth. At around 14, he watched a horrific scene unfold. A young black man from the community, accused of raping a white woman, was dragged through the streets and lynched on a tree just beyond the shop's windows. This kind of summary execution without even the merest notion of a trial was a harsh reality of that World War I-era America. Beneath the idol, there was a hatred and mob mentality that could turn to barbarism in a moment. That memory stuck with Henry, and he had a lifelong commitment to racial justice. His days laboring for his father and later at the local telephone company built him into a sturdy young man. By the time he finished high school, he stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and muscular. Still bashful around girls, but physically formidable. He enrolled at the University of Minnesota to study journalism, a choice that was more about his family's aspirations than his own. His grades flagged, his enthusiasm waned, and he soon quit the school. Back in Omaha by 1925, Henry bounced between odd jobs. He hauled ice, tinkered with cars, and even dressed up the windows of local women's clothing shops. Nothing held his attention until he stumbled into the Omaha Community Playhouse. At first, he took on manual jobs building sets and sweeping floors after the crowds cleared out. The idea of stepping onto the stage felt absurd, especially to someone so reserved. That changed when Dodie Brando, a friend of his mother's, nudged him toward a new path in life. She told him that her son, Marlon, had shaken off his own shyness through acting. She urged Henry to audition for a small role in a play called You and I. Skeptical but willing, he tried out and landed the part of Ricky. The experience was agonizing, and he was almost passing out from nerves and embarrassment. He later confessed, "It was a nightmare. I didn't dare look up. I was the kind of guy who thinks everybody is looking at him." Acting certainly woke up something in Henry, but his parents weren't exactly thrilled. William and Herberta were solid middle American folks. Theater might have shed its old reputation as a den of vice, but it still didn't rank as a proper career for a grown man in their eyes. Hoping to steer him toward stability, William pulled some strings to land Henry a starter job at the Retail Credit Company of Omaha. The stage tugged at their son's heart, but they wanted him grounded in something safer, something real. By then, the die was cast. In the spring of 1926, a Lincoln impersonator named George Billings hired him for a Midwest speaking tour. Fonda adapted Lincoln's iconic speeches into scripts and took on the role of Major John Hay, Lincoln's aide. The duo crisscrossed the region, bringing the dramatic life of Abraham Lincoln to small theaters hungry for fresh entertainment. Audiences loved it. One night on that tour, a buddy from Omaha traveling alongside him set up a double date with two sisters, Bobby and Betty. In classic 1920s fashion, the pairs ended up parked behind Princeton Stadium. Fonda, still reserved but buzzed from the newness of it all, leaned over and planted a quick kiss on 17-year-old Betty. The next morning his phone rang. Betty, flustered, said her mother demanded they wed. Fonda bolted back to Omaha, thinking he'd dodged a bullet. About 12 years later, he'd cross paths with Betty Davis again, when they starred together in That Certain Woman. He'd later quip, "I've been close to Betty Davis for 38 years, and I have the cigarette burns to prove it." Back in Omaha, Fonda knew he'd found his calling. He stayed on at the community playhouse for another year, assisting the director and jumping into every play he could. The productions varied wildly in quality. By late 1928, he felt ready for bigger stages. He left his job and headed east. Fonda's first East Coast gig came at the Cape Playhouse in Dennis, Massachusetts. To his astonishment, he won the lead in The Barker, a Broadway success that had trickled up north. But the coastal theaters only thrived in summer, when tourists were there. Come fall, the curtain dropped and Henry was out of work. He spent the next 2 winters in Washington, D.C., performing with the National Junior Theater for Kids. By 1930, he was back in Omaha, leading the community playhouse's A Kiss for Cinderella. Around then, he met Margaret Sullivan. A romance began, albeit in a very on-and-off fashion. However, Henry's words about her positively glowed with awe. He once called her cream and sugar on a dish of hot ashes. Later, he elaborated, "She was not an easy woman to categorize or to explain. If I've ever known anyone in my life, man or woman, who was unique, it was she. There was nobody like her before or since, never will be, in every way. In talent, in looks, in character, in temperament, everything." They married on Christmas Day, 1931. The marriage lasted mere months before they separated, and then divorced in 1933, Yet 13 years later, they'd live near each other, shuttling kids to the same events and even co-starring in a 1936 film. The breakup crushed Fonda at first. He later recalled, "My thinking was scrambled when Sullivan and I separated. Something happened to me that had never happened before. I couldn't cope. It was heartbreak time. I thought it was the end of the world." Shortly after his divorce was finalized, Henry relocated to New York City to start a career on Broadway. He was accompanied by James Stewart, a fellow actor whom he had met during his time in Massachusetts. Like many aspiring performers during the Great Depression, they had to deal with working intermittently over the next year. Henry's breakthrough came in the summer of 1934, when he landed a role in New Faces. This musical demanded that he sing and dance. A totally alien challenge tested him and made him show off his versatility. His efforts caught the attention of Leland Hayward, a talent scout affiliated with Myron Selznick. Hayward proposed a deal. If Fonda agreed to travel to Hollywood, Selznick could arrange a film contract offering $750 per week. Henry hesitated. He later said, "It wasn't my ambitions to be in the movies." The relentless cycle of short-term theatrical engagements had left him weary, and so the prospect of a new adventure ultimately won out over his reservations. In August 1934, he found himself in Hollywood, meeting producer Walter Wanger beneath the shade of a palm tree. The terms of the deal astonished him. "I could go back to my beloved theater in the winter and come out the next summer to do 2 pictures for $1,000 a week." I turned to Hayward and said, "There's something fishy." I just couldn't believe it, and he laughed and laughed. As you might imagine, Fonda accepted. On October 30th, 1934, he opened on Broadway in The Farmer Takes a Wife. His portrayal of Dan Harrow earned high praise. Director Victor Fleming agreed with the assessments and picked Fonda to reprise his role as Dan Harrow in the cinematic version of The Farmer Takes a Wife. As he set out on his debut film role, Henry quickly figured out the distinctions between stage and screen acting. On stage, he had projected his voice to reach the furthest seats. In front of a camera, he needed to adjust his delivery to avoid overwhelming the sensitive microphones. He mastered this shift quicker than most. Hollywood also introduced him to the network of relationships among its luminaries. During his early months there, he constantly ran into his ex-wife, Margaret Sullivan, who had recently divorced director William Wyler, the same Wyler who would later direct Fonda in Jezebel. Leland Hayward, their shared agent, would soon marry Sullivan as her third husband. Aside from the relationship circus, Henry found himself reveling in the fresh chapter of his life. He now earned a handsome $3,000 weekly salary. Rumors swirled about his romantic entanglements with Hollywood's leading ladies, from Carole Lombard to Greta Garbo. Better still, his pal Jimmy Stewart had followed him out to Los Angeles. The two, who had once shared quarters back east, resumed their cozy domestic arrangement in Tinseltown. In 1935, Fonda had a role in I Dream Too Much, a picture that won over reviewers, and it seemed the shy boy had grown into a leading man. One critic dubbed him the most likable of a new crop of romantic juveniles. The following year, 1936, brought Henry to Trail of the Lonesome Pine, where he acted alongside Fred McMurray. This film was a milestone. It was the first to be shot in color and on location outdoors, an impressive technical achievement for its time. Later that year, he paired with Margaret Sullivan in The Moon's Our Home. Their on- and off-screen chemistry reignited the old flame. They started to talk of a second marriage, but old quarrels from their Massachusetts days soon resurfaced. They concluded that friendship suited them better, and so they parted amicably. Hollywood in the 1930s gorged itself on scandal and betrayal, but audiences still wanted stories of happily ever after in the movies themselves, especially for their brightest screen stars. It was a strange dynamic when you think about it. Henry's publicity team worked this sentiment pretty well. They built an image of him as a wholesome, earnest fellow eager to find his soulmate. A May 1936 magazine piece declared, "Henry Fonda says it's all right with him if he gets married by next Christmas. He has just bought a home in Beverly Hills, and although he admits that there is no immediate prospect of a Mrs. Henry Fonda, the house is all ready for her." Fate, however, had other plans. On July 10th, producer Walter Wanger dispatched Henry to London for Wings of the Morning, a romantic tale directed by Alexander Korda. Filmed in the lush landscapes of Surrey, England, and Kilkenny, Ireland, it was Europe's first Technicolor production. But critics and fans found it a pretty underwhelming movie. For Henry, the trip was life-changing. There he met Frances Ford Brokaw, a 28-year-old widow of millionaire George Brokaw. Petite, blonde, and beautiful, she claimed descent from Henry VIII's third wife, the tragic Jane Seymour. Born in Canada and raised among its high society, she brought along a 4-year-old daughter, Frances, nicknamed Pan, and a massive inheritance. And yet it was she who pursued Henry relentlessly across the Atlantic. He didn't take much convincing, though. Back in America, they wed on September 16, 1936. A little over a year later, their daughter, Lady Jane Seymour, arrived. After a short honeymoon, the couple settled in Hollywood, where Henry's career marched forward. But he was about to get another bitter taste of life's dark side. In 1937, his close friend Ross Alexander took his own life, a year after his first wife, actress Alida Friel, had done the same thing. He was just 30 years old, and this shocked Henry deeply. The tragedy had implications far beyond the movie industry. As ever, Alexander's studio, Warner Brothers, were in a panic not about the tragic loss of a young man, but about the sudden lack of a particular type of actor. They scrambled to fill the void, and plucked a young actor from obscurity due to his similarity to Alexander in voice and looks. The actor in question was Ronald Reagan, who, of course, leveraged this break into Hollywood to become one of the most important political figures of the 20th century. In 1938, Henry was on the set of Jezebel alongside co-star Bette Davis. What transpired between them off-camera remains a mystery, although there were rumors of an affair in the press, but their on-screen pairing dazzled. Davis portrayed a petulant Southern belle in pre-Civil War New Orleans, while Fonda played her impulsive fiancé who deserts her. Jezebel is a gem that still feels timeless today. Before I go on with Henry Fonda's life, I'd like to take a moment to remind everyone that we have a range of in-house designed shirts for sale over at our store. There are designs featuring everyone from Pola Negri to William Powell to Steve McQueen and Peter Lorre. I think the shirts are pretty cool, and they come in a range of sizes and colors, and they will definitely impress your Hollywood-loving friends and family, but most of all, every sale really helps out the channel. They are selling fast, so be sure to grab one before they are gone. Interlude over. Let's get back to the rise of Henry Fonda. If 1938 secured Fonda's reputation, 1939 shot it to new heights. He took on a role he considered one of his favorites, in young Mr. Lincoln, under the masterful direction of John Ford. Ford envisioned Lincoln not as the grave statesman of later years, but as, quote, a jackleg young lawyer from Springfield. He insisted Henry was the only actor for the part. The film became one of Henry's defining performances, and a lot of commentators were surprised when he didn't get an Oscar nomination. Henry felt in awe of the mighty Ford, though. He later talked about Ford's personality in an interview. He was so egomaniacal. He would never rehearse, didn't want to talk about a part. If an actor started to ask questions, he'd either take those pages and tear them out of the script, or insult him in an awful way. He loved getting his shot on the first take, which for him meant it was fresh. He would print the first take even if it wasn't any good. After embodying one of America's greatest presidents, Henry went for someone altogether more infamous in his next role. In 1939, he took on the role of Frank James in the film Jesse James. This was his debut in a major Western, a genre that soon saw him back under Ford's direction for Drums Along the Mohawk. Here, he starred alongside Claudette Colbert as Gilbert and Magdalena Morton, a pioneer couple who braved the early American frontier. Henry's performance was another success. The film itself literally dazzled. Ford had mastered the use of Technicolor to weave sweeping mountain landscapes against the shadowy cabin interiors, in what was a very romantic vision of the early United States. By this stage, Henry had carved out a particular persona, the weathered, resolute everyman rooted in the earth. At the time, there was a growing feeling of togetherness among Americans as they banded together during the worst financial crisis the nation had ever faced. Audiences saw in him a neighbor who might have been laid off, or a drifter hopping freight trains during the Depression. This stoic, reflective archetype was precisely what Ford wanted for his next triumph, The Grapes of Wrath, released in 1940. Ford was again emphatic that Henry alone could play Tom Joad. Henry agreed, as did the public in time. Yet producer Darryl F. Zanuck hesitated, and he wanted Tyrone Power for the lead. To make sure he got the part, Henry struck a deal. He signed a 7-year contract with Zanuck's 20th Century Fox. That gamble paid off handsomely for the rising star. The Grapes of Wrath gave Henry his first Oscar nomination, and the movie is considered an American cultural touchstone still today. Many have said it was, in fact, his finest hour. Set during the Great Depression, Tom Joad is a kind of icon for the era's downtrodden. "I'll be all around in the dark," he declares. "I'll be everywhere, wherever you can look, wherever there's a fight, so hungry people can eat. I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad. I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when the people are eating the stuff they raise and living in the houses they build, I'll be there too." Later that year, Henry went back to Westerns, taking the lead in the return of Frank James. He shared the screen with the beautiful and tragic Jean Tierney, a co-star he'd reunite with in the light-hearted Rings on Her Fingers. If you want to know more about her heartbreaking life story, I have a video on her linked on screen now and down in the description. Sandwiched between those pictures, he teamed with Barbara Stanwyck in The Lady Eve. This venture into comedy, his first on film, was a smash hit. The movie now holds a spot on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 funniest films ever made. By late 1941, the United States had entered into World War II. Hollywood stars began trading scripts for service, including James Stewart, who was already piloting bombers for the Army Air Corps. Henry itched to join his friend and the other men serving, but his contract with 20th Century Fox tethered him to civilian life. John Ford, ever the persuader, told him to channel his skills into patriotic films that helped the war effort, at least for now. Henry voiced Ford's documentary on the Battle of Midway as a start, but as the war went on, narrating from the sidelines would no longer do. On August 24, 1942, fresh off wrapping the Oxbow incident, he pulled up to the Navy's Los Angeles headquarters and signed up. "I'd like to be with the fellows who handle the guns," he told the recruiters. He'd hoped to slip in unnoticed, but the press pounced on him as soon as he was sighted. A reporter chronicled the scene. Without the usual Hollywood fanfare, Fonda waited in line with other prospective recruits, took his medical examination, and was sworn in. Recruiting officer Lieutenant Blanchard said, "Fonda will be sent to San Diego within a few days and can realize his wish to, quote, handle the guns by competing for a rating in the Gunner's Mate School. It has been my desire to join the service for a long time," Fonda said, "and I am glad that I am able to get in and do a little pitching." Henry opted for the humblest entry, apprentice seaman. Over the next few years, Henry climbed the Navy ladder. He was a quartermaster on the USS Satterley in Seattle, then rose to lieutenant. Then in Washington, D.C., an unexpected door opened. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS as it was better known, the wartime precursor to the CIA, tapped him. He was intrigued, and so for the rest of the war, he operated in the murky realm of intelligence. Records suggest he had a sharp mind for the work, an undercover natural, but the OSS were not planning on sending Henry Fonda out into the world as a spy. Instead, he analyzed data, leaning on the steel trap memory he'd gained from years of memorizing lines. His service earned him a Bronze Star and a Navy Presidential Unit citation. To the world, Henry's enlistment seemed like selfless valor. Those closest to him knew the full story a little better. By joining the Navy, he escaped a losing battle at home. The real war raged within his marriage to Frances, with their children, Jane and Peter, caught in the crossfire. The couple had been wed nearly a year when Henry first sensed trouble. Frances buzzed with anxious energy, which he chalked up to impending motherhood. After Jane's birth in 1937, he figured her fretting was just instinctive maternal protectiveness. She insisted he mask up to hold their newborn, and then fretted over phantom ailments. But he was sure this would pass. But as years passed, her nerves frayed further. By Peter's arrival in 1940, she'd spiraled into a hypochondriac's nightmare, constantly haunted by invisible germs and imagined sickness. Henry, who was raised in a family where vitality and good health was assumed, and complaining was taboo, couldn't cope with it. He expected her to tough it out. When she couldn't, he swung between angry outbursts at the kids and withdrawing entirely, burying himself in film sets. Their daughter Jane, later a huge star herself of course, recalled, "Dad was so emotionally distant, with a coldness that Mother was not equipped to breach." A friend from her youth added, "We were all afraid of Jane's father in those days. We always felt that he was a time bomb ready to explode." When World War II drew to a close, the Fonda family settled into their gleaming new estate, Tigertail, nestled in an exclusive corner of Beverly Hills. This sprawling property was the neighborhood's crown jewel. A 1948 magazine gushed that it was probably the most carefully planned home in these United States. Before even the cement was mixed, trees were removed and transplanted on the grounds, flower beds were set out, a citrus grove was planted, and gardens were mapped. Yet for all the meticulous care Henry and Frances poured into this idyllic retreat for their children, they neglected the family's emotional core. Henry buried himself in work, his absences stretching longer each time. Frances lost herself in a haze of pills. Throughout the war and into the post-war years, she cycled through hospitals, admitted repeatedly for what the era delicately termed nervous symptoms. When not confined to a ward, she also often strayed into the arms of other men. Henry's homecoming from the Navy brought no fanfare, only a cold realization that his place in their bed in their home had vanished. Frances had become fixated on managing their finances and had strewn bills and ledgers across his side of the mattress. He retreated to the guest room or beyond for the remainder of their marriage. Frances's mental struggles were real, but she had ample cause to distance herself from Henry, both in heart and body. During the war, while he was away, she faced a paternity suit from a woman alleging an affair with Henry had produced a child. The claim fizzled out post-war, but the damage lingered on. Frances and their daughter Jane had no doubts about his infidelity. Jane, in fact, long insisted her father's frequent betrayals fueled her mother's mental anguish and early demise. Neither, it seems, were able to remain faithful to the other, no matter who started it. In that first year after the war, Henry and Frances made an attempt at reconciliation. Rather than diving back into Hollywood, Henry decided to try out the role of a gentleman farmer at Tigertail. He earned a local chuckle or two for his earnest pontifications on the merits of manure, which he credited for his lush lawn and blooming gardens. He was at least back in his element, the outdoors. Frances, meanwhile, turned inward. Her own mortality loomed larger in her mind, as did the slow loss of her youthful beauty. Eventually, her doctors pinned her troubles on hormones and prescribed the era's go-to remedy, a hysterectomy. That summer of 1946, Henry was off shooting My Darling Clementine across Utah and Arizona. Frances kept her surgical plans under wraps. She claimed instead she was on a trip to New York to see her eldest daughter, Pan. She checked into Johns Hopkins Medical Center, underwent the procedure, healed, and slipped back home, all before Henry caught wind of it. Henry kept his career humming, churning out roughly a film a year. In 1947, he wrapped up his obligations with 20th Century Fox and signed on with John Ford's new studio, Argosy Pictures. He'd never again tie himself to a studio contract, but he took the chance to team up with Ford on The Fugitive. This film followed a Mexican priest hunted to martyrdom by a Marxist regime. The next year, Henry saddled up for yet another Ford Western, starring in Fort Apache. His character's daughter was played by Shirley Temple, by then moving into adulthood. The war may have ended, but it still reverberated across America's theaters and cinemas. An old theater buddy, Joshua Logan, reached out with a role that seemed tailor-made for him, and indeed it was. The prospect of Mr. Roberts, a Navy comedy, brought Henry back to Broadway. He leapt at it, packed his bags, and bid farewell to his family once more, this time bound for New York. Among the few belongings he took was his Navy officer's cap, which he wore nightly on stage. Mr. Roberts was the greatest achievement of Fonda's theatrical career, and it won him his sole Tony Award for Best Actor in 1948. Critics loved the show and ticket buyers lined up, but even as he basked in the spotlight and the break from the intense atmosphere at home, Henry wrestled with guilt over abandoning Frances, Jane, and Peter at Tigertail. When it became clear his New York stint would stretch on for longer than planned, he brought them out east. That he'd invite Frances at all, given their miserable situation, was a little surprising. That she agreed to uproot herself was perhaps even more startling. But beneath her struggles, she was a committed wife and mother. She sold Tigertail, and they relocated to a stylish Greenwich Village home in New York. Did Henry think the stage could rewind the clock, restoring the hope and vigor of his 20s? Did he imagine shedding his early 40s for a brighter past? He never said. Emotions weren't exactly his strong suit, even with his close friends. But any such dreams soon faded. Frances was as desperate in New York as she had been in California. Their new house, though grand and cozy, had a Victorian Gothic gloom, hardly a great environment for her morbid obsession and depression. Her health faltered. A 1949 bladder surgery left an ugly scar across her stomach, which worsened her fixation on her waning looks. She now felt old and mutilated. She obsessed over her own vitality and her children's too. Her fears weren't entirely misplaced. Jane, now a young teen, was quietly battling an eating disorder that would shadow her for decades. Peter, frail and prone to every passing cold and flu, fared little better. A warmer soul might have stepped in to mend the family's cracks, but Henry doubled down on denial. Frances went to the hospital. He took the stage. In this chaos, he found his emotional warmth somewhere else. Susan Blanchard, the 21-year-old stepdaughter of lyricist Oscar Hammerstein II, entered his romantic orbit in 1948. What began as a casual fling soon went deeper, and Henry started thinking about a future with her. By fall 1949, he told Frances about the affair and requested a divorce. He later wrote that she accepted it gracefully. He even claimed that she wrote to a mutual friend wishing him, quote, better luck with his third marriage than he had had with theirs. But time revealed a darker truth. Either Frances's calm was a mask, or Henry had spun this story from thin air. In spring 1950, she admitted herself to an upscale mental health retreat, which was a haven for the unraveling nerves of various elite figures. This was beyond hypochondria now. She was suicidal. She did in fact show signs of progress. Her doctors grew hopeful and granted her a brief leave to see the family. However, that choice proved fatal. While visiting her eldest daughter, Pan, Frances took a razor blade from the bathroom. She smuggled it back to the facility, and on April 14th, her 42nd birthday, she slit her own throat in the pre-dawn quiet, bleeding out before anyone noticed. The hospital alerted Henry at once. He drove in, retrieved her body, and arranged a private funeral attended only by him and Frances's mother, Sophie. He then shipped her remains to Hartsdale, New York for cremation and burial. Only after tying these grim knots did he break the news to Jane and Peter. He spared them the suicide and told them instead that she'd succumbed to a heart attack in care. That night, after claiming her body, burying her, and softening her death for his kids, Fonda strode on stage as if nothing had happened. This behavior certainly invites a few questions. Was he, as one physician sneered, a cold, self-absorbed person, a complete narcissist, or a mourning man, drowning his guilt in the one world he could still navigate? Detractors leaned one way, admirers the other, as such divides often go. There's a fine line between the two. Months later, Henry wed Blanchard. 2 years on, they adopted a daughter, Amy, only to split by 1956. Mr. Roberts played on Broadway for another year before shuttering in January 1951. Henry could have headed straight back to Hollywood's film lots then, but he stayed on in New York's theater scene. He took the lead in Point of No Return, a war drama, and followed it with the Caine Mutiny court-martial. Only the chance to bring Mr. Roberts to the screen lured him west again. Reuniting with Ford gave him mixed feelings, though. Henry later said, Ford didn't know what to do with Mr. Roberts that wasn't repeating what was successful in New York. He was trying to do things to the play that would be his in the film. His unease wasn't totally baseless. At 45, he felt too old to play a restless young officer hungry for combat. Plus, after years away from filmmaking, its pressures fatigued him more than ever. This blew up into a heated argument with Ford, who in a flash of temper punched Fonda. The punch didn't wound Henry too much, but it killed their working relationship. Henry swore off Ford forever. Yet he looked back at the incident later more in confusion than anger. I don't know what was in his mind, but I do know Ford was stricken by what he had done, by hitting me, he said. Hollywood still clamored for Henry. From 1954 to 1956, he starred opposite Audrey Hepburn in an adaptation of Tolstoy's War and Peace, a war tale far removed from his usual fare. He complained about the process. When I first agreed to do it, the screenplay by Irwin Shaw was fine, but what happened? King Vidor used to go home nights with his wife and rewrite it. All the genius of Tolstoy went out the window. Even so, his skill, and not to mention Hepburn's, cut through the muddle, and the film was a decent success. Next, Fonda worked with Alfred Hitchcock for The Wrong Man. This film was unusual in Hitchcock's catalog, as it was in a near-documentary style. It took its suspense from a real case, published in book form as the true story of Christopher Emmanuel Balestrero, an innocent man convicted of a crime. Hitchcock even shot scenes at the actual locations, and his quite radical commitment to realism led to this film being a huge influence on directors like Jean-Luc Godard. After his marriage to Susan failed in 1956, Henry married Afdera Franchetti, an Italian countess he'd met on the War and Peace set, in 1957. This marriage burned out as quickly as the previous one, and by 1960 he'd begun seeing Shirley May Adams. He dumped Franchetti in 1961 and married Adams, finally a match that suited him, and it stuck until his final days. By 1957, Fonda felt experienced enough in the movie business to step behind the lens and try out production. He produced 12 Angry Men, a film based on a hit TV movie. The story unfolds almost entirely in a cramped jury room, where Fonda, as juror number 8, stands alone against 11 peers set on condemning a young man for murder. The project looks shaky at first. Cash-strapped, Henry raced to shoot it in 17 days, which was a brutal pace for a stickler like him. In short, the film set itself up for failure from day one in the eyes of many. In fact, it was a masterpiece. Henry won an Oscar nod for Best Picture as producer, plus a 1958 BAFTA for Best Actor and another Oscar nomination. Audiences warmed to it post-nominations too, and it remains one of the most highly rated movies of the 50s today. Still producing wore Henry out. He swore he'd never do it again. He kept that promise for films, but dipped into producing a brief Western TV series, The Deputy. From 1959 to 1961, he played Marshal Simon Fry, a lawman in a frontier town. The role came naturally after recent westerns like The Tin Star from 1957 and Warlock, which released in 1959. He didn't hog the screen, though. He was often narrating more than acting, and left the heavy lifting to his deputy, portrayed by Alan Case. If he believed the new decade would bring him more positive news in his personal life, this would be shattered in less than one day. In the late afternoon of January 1st, 1960, his first love and ex-wife, Margaret Sullivan, was found dead at the age of 50 in murky circumstances, which were ruled as an accidental barbiturate overdose. There's more to this story that I'll get into in a future video, but her passing was another tragedy for Henry. This was further compounded by the death of Margaret's daughter, Bridget, who died by suicide later that same year. Interestingly, Henry's son Peter would name his own daughter, actress Bridget Fonda, after Margaret's tragic daughter. Through the 1960s, Henry leaned heavily on his World War II days. The war was a thread that ran through much of his work. In 1962's The Longest Day, for example, he stepped into the boots of General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and an important figure in the D-Day assault. He also took center stage in Harm's Way and the Battle of the Bulge, both in 1965. Yet his standout role of the decade was a shaggy-haired buffalo hunter in How the West Was Won. This sprawling epic roped in nearly every big name of the era and traced America's national saga from 1842 to the 1880s. John Ford helmed 2 chapters out of the 5, but Henry appeared in one directed by Henry Hathaway. He was still not on speaking terms with the curmudgeonly and downright violent Ford. The film was a critical darling at the time. Though Westerns had a tricky decade in general, Hollywood began rethinking the old cowboy versus Indian tales. The first signs of a new era for the genre came with Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, where Henry played a ruthless crook named Frank. He declined at first, but his friend Eli Wallach and Leone, who jetted in from Italy to sweet-talk him, won him over. Henry suggested brown contacts to darken his gaze for the more sinister part, but Leone said no. The director wanted those baby blues to jar against Frank's malice, and this was also a sign that the tired tropes of good and evil were becoming more nuanced in how they were shown on screen. Not every Fonda film of the 60s was mired in conflict or grit. In 1963, he led Spencer's Mountain, a snapshot of a Wyoming family scraping by during the Depression. The pitch may sound grim, but the film is heartwarming. Audiences loved it, but Henry didn't really care for it. He found it too quaint for such raw times as the 60s. A decade later, it birthed the hit series, The Waltons. 5 years on, Henry again played a patriarch in Yours, Mine, and Ours, opposite Lucille Ball. The film let Henry, a self-proclaimed liberal, tackle the arrival of a more radical counterculture head-on. "They've gone too far now," he said, "and we are all so satiated with the extremes. With what they call reality, I refuse to admit this degradation is reality." His character's tirade against the sexual revolution steals the show. Off-screen, though, his daughter Jane embodied that very rebellion. A radical leftist, she became an anti-Vietnam War icon, later nicknamed Hanoi Jane for posing with a North Vietnamese gun. Their differing politics layered over old wounds, which reduced their relationship to near silence. Fonda, ever discreet, refused to discuss her lifestyle and politics publicly, insisting they were hers and hers alone. He was in easier company with his old friend James Stewart. They teamed up in Fire Creek in 1968, and again in the Cheyenne Social Club a couple of years later, a light Western comedy. That film let them spar over politics on screen, which was reflective of their real-life debates. Henry was a proud Democrat who defied McCarthyism's blacklist. Like most centrists, he found himself with enemies on either side. He often debated with Stewart, a hardline Republican who'd cheered Ronald Reagan's rise from governor to president. But they eventually avoided political talk to preserve their friendship. Henry didn't confine himself to Hollywood in the 1960s. He went from coast to coast, working roles that often left him bone-tired. In fall 1959, he landed in New York for Silent Night, Lonely Night, a two-hander play. He portrayed a man stranded by a storm in a New England inn on Christmas Eve, who shares the night with a woman considering splitting up with her husband. Their talk unveils his own secret. He's there to see his wife, locked away in a nearby asylum. The man blames himself. His affairs pushed her over the edge, and unsurprisingly, Henry played the gnawing remorse with depth. "I imagine if we could hear all the stifled cries for help in the world, it would be deafening," his character laments. Surely, if ever there was one, this was a line that mirrored Henry's own dark shadows. The next winter, he debuted in Critics' Choice as Parker Ballantine, a theater critic wrestling with how to review his wife's dreadful play. Critics, the real ones, loved it, and the show clocked over 180 nights. Come early 1962, Fonda tackled a tougher role, Charles Christian Wertenbaker, in A Gift of Time. This writer living in France had terminal cancer, and after months of agony ended his life in 1954. His wife, Lael, helped him and later wrote The Death of a Man, a work so powerful it led to America's first real euthanasia debate. Henry and Olivia de Havilland, who played Lael, dug deep into themselves, and they went to France to trace Wertenbaker's final days. Henry explained, "We talked to the Wertenbaker's doctor and some of his Basque friends. What strong faces they had." It was the closest he ever came to method acting, though he shrugged off the label. "I can't articulate about the method, because I've never studied it. I don't know what the method is, and I don't care what the method is." Henry hit the boards twice more that decade. In 1969, he played Jim Bolton in Generation, a comedy poking at America's generational gap, which was now wider than the Grand Canyon. The film version flopped, but his stage turn was great, running to 300 performances. He capped the 60s as a stage manager in a limited run of Our Town. By March 1972, he was back on stage at Los Angeles' Huntington Hartford Theater in The Time of Your Life, joined by Richard Dreyfuss and Jane Alexander. In 1974, he took on Broadway solo as Clarence Darrow, the famed lawyer of the Scopes trial. This earned him a Tony nomination, but the performance also revealed his own frailty by this time. A collapse mid-show that April revealed heart arrhythmia and prostate cancer. 3 years later, he played a weary Supreme Court justice in First Monday of October. Working on stage was even harder than film, and on doctor's orders, he retired from theater. By his 70s, his film opportunities had thinned, so Fonda went to TV. He led ABC's The Family in 1971 to 1972, then starred in 1973's The Red Pony. In 1976, he played General Douglas MacArthur in Collision Course, opposite E.G. Marshall's Harry Truman. His mid-70s peak was Midway, where he once more put on a Navy uniform as the legendary Admiral Chester Nimitz. Henry gave him nuance, and made him into something more than just another stiff hero. Fonda also showed up in some of the era's popular disaster movies. Battling bees in the swarm with Mark Etienne and Fred McMurray, in Meteor as the President, and City on Fire as Fire Chief Albert Risley. His swan song on Golden Pond came in 1981. Now a star herself, Jane Fonda bought up the rights, and the plan was to repair their relationship by acting with her dad. He knew who was to blame. "I'm not trying to set myself up as a good father, because I wasn't a good father." The film, a daughter and her aloof father struggling for connection, hit very close to home. Their real tension made the film into something emotionally exceptional, and their effort was rewarded by critics and audiences. A nationwide rollout in January raked in nearly $120 million and 10 Oscar nominations. Fonda at 76 won Best Actor, his first, decades after Grapes of Wrath. He was too frail for the ceremony, so he watched as Jane accepted it, saying, "Hey, ain't I lucky?" But it wasn't luck that brought them success. It was two fine actors at the peak of their craft who just so happened to be a real-life father and daughter trying to understand how to love one another. Norman Thayer, his character, nearly dies of a heart attack on screen. Henry didn't outlast him long. Heart disease claimed him on August 12, 1982. By then, he'd rebuilt bridges with Jane and Peter. His wife Shirley stood by him at the end. Per his wishes, there was no funeral. His ashes went straight to his family. A magazine called him the man we wished we lived next door to, a generous gloss over of a man who was far more complex and far darker than his screen image pretended. Henry Fonda's flaws, aloof, imperfect as a father or friend, dogged him, but he could transcend them on stage or on screen. "I ain't really Henry Fonda," he once quipped. "Nobody could be." Maybe not, but he played the part better than most. That's all for this week's episode. Please consider liking and subscribing, as it's the best way to give the channel a boost with the YouTube algorithm. I'd like to shout out our Patreon and YouTube members who have signed up to support us. I really appreciate those of you who feel you can help the channel grow. Thank you. There's a link in the description if you'd like to sign up, and there are various perks if you do so, not least the weekly Hollywood Histories essays. Until next week, sweet dreams.